It gives me a great deal of pleasure today to introduce a genuine celebrity. And I call him a celebrity because those of you who saw that nice dapper picture of him in a bow tie, this is from his work on cruise ships, where they have a celebrity series or celebrity talks, and that's one of the pictures from that. So he's officially now a celebrity. I'm going to give a very brave praise to you of Tony's work. Tony's had an extraordinary career over many years and a real impact in the way sex offenders are treated. For example, in England and Wales, he was responsible with Dawn Fisher and Richard Becker for developing the sex offender treatment programs and the incredible work which went into that, in developing treatment programs with demonstrated effectiveness, with very strong psychometric rigor at the beginning for going into the programs and at the end, as well as measuring the response to this treatment. There's an awful lot on typologies as well. And rather than being simply a crusty old academic in academia, he's also got his hands dirty. My first experience of working with Tony was listening to hundreds of tapes which he'd had when he'd been interviewing convicted child molesters about their thoughts around sex with children. He subsequently went on to interview every sexual murderer in England and Wales who was prepared to talk to him, and has done some incredible work over the point of his career. Tony, rather than being one of those people who has a good idea early on in their career and just repeats it for the next 30 years, believes that he's now actually at his peak, and he's now working very much in the area of forensic neuroscience. He's got a new book which will come out on that, which is coming out imminently, and that's going to be a substantial part of his talk today. So let's give him a warm round of applause.
Is this on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I was rather hoping to give a piano recital, but we can't get the piano open, so I'll have to talk to you instead. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. So this is going to be a very quick whiz through some stuff about neuroscience, really. And does it help us to understand the brain, to help us understand how we can treat people better? For quite a few years, I've been trying to move out of the sex offender stuff, to be quite honest. And I think I've finally got there, really, because I think as a friend and colleague once said, Ruth Mann said to me, actually, there aren't that many sex offenders, but most of the people in prison, certainly in the UK, well, from what I hear, it's the same here. Most of the people in prison are not sex offenders, but they're just generally violent offenders or acquisitive offenders who are in for a very short space of time. They come out, and then they're back in again. And if you're going to do any therapy with them, it's going to be kind of quite short therapy. And I guess that's what I've been interested in, really. Have we got other things we can do for therapy for those people that is not sitting there talking to them for a long period of time? Because the more I've looked at the field, the more I think a cognitive behavioural treatment only goes so far. Really, that we need to get beyond that, really sort of more kind of neuroscientific approach, really. Just as I say to you, I've decided, instead of this hour seminar, I'm going to talk to you to 12 o'clock at night, because I'm sure I could do this. And you're going to stay here and listen. By about 11 o'clock tonight, you're probably going to think, I've had enough. And as for treatment of offenders, do you honestly think you can sit them down and talk to them for 2 hours? So I think we need to get a bit beyond that. So that's the aim of this talk anyway. So that's me. I just recently retired, but I've still got a position. I've still got an email anyway. I haven't got an office, I don't think, anymore, so just moving on this. If you want to get hold of me, that's my email there. It's anything that you want. I always say that if you can learn 3 things, though, in a talk, you're doing well. So, do people know what B on a keyboard will do on PowerPoint? No, that's good. It switches off. So you can come on. You can come on. If you want to give a really, or if you want to switch PowerPoint, if you want to come on and you look really slick, you come on. There's nothing on. That's one thing you learn. Press B, come back on. There's 2 things you do. And anyone like to guess what W does on Mexican white? And there are, so 3 things we learned in this talk, so I'll go now.
And your email address.
And my email address. 4 things, in fact. Okay. I think that's quite handy to know really how to switch the power off. Anyway, scope of problem being crime. In the UK, accounts for about 124 billion a year, so nearly 10% of gross domestic product. And if we look, September 2016, if you see that sexual offences have gone up, violent offences have gone up, most offences have actually gone up dramatically. There's a lot of people to deal with. And really the aim of this talk is to put forward what we can do in terms of treatment based on what we started to understand about from a neuroscientific perspective. Because we know a lot of offenders have got problems with impulsivity, general self-regulation problems, they're not empathetic, they can't really take other people's points of view, and they're not very good at problem solving. So a lot of them have been subject to significant amount of early trauma. So what I'm going to talk about a bit later is a lot of risk factors for offending, basically. These are the kind of problems that people have got. And to my mind, you can't just sit down with people and just kind of talk to them for several hours. Okay, we're going to get some empathy in you now. Okay, we're going to talk to you about empathy. Honestly, I think the best way to inculcate empathy in people is get them to read. Get them to read and put them in other people's perspective. And as a current president of the United States that actually is proud that he's never read a book in his life, Donald J. Trump. I was actually saying to Mark, I did another talk on empathy recently, and I got various quotes on empathy, and a classic one that Walker might in somebody else's shoes, and then Obama's got some good quotes about empathy. And I thought, I wonder if Donald Trump has said anything about empathy. Well, he didn't say anything about empathy per se, but he said something once that clearly, I thought this man clearly lacks any kind of empathy whatsoever. Apparently after the Twin Towers were razed to the ground, Donald Trump's response to that was, I now have the tallest building in Lower Manhattan. Anyway, so a lot of offenders have got problems in those areas. A lot of them have got attachment problems from early childhood. A lot have been subject to early trauma. My argument in this talk is that traditional talking therapies are going to be inadequate. We need therapies to work at an emotional level and use techniques to promote cortical growth. So that's where I'm going to go with this talk. Is everybody happy with that? So it's in three sections really. The first section is an overview of the brain. The second section is overview of risk factors. And the risk factors that can really alter the brain's architecture. And the third bit is just talking about some therapies that go beyond the kind of traditional talking therapies. So that's where I'm going. As Mark said, if you want to read all about this, for a mere £250, we've got a book coming out next year, which is a handbook of forensic neuroscience that goes all the way through from sort of like neuroscience of emotional regulation, neuroscience of empathy, all the way to risk factors for offending, all the way to stuff about different problems like psychopathy and social personality disorder, and a big section on kind of treatments. Okay, so if you press me, I can send you a few of the PDFs of a few of those chapters. I didn't give you that book, I gave you another book, didn't I? That's period chapters. Okay. So first section, let's talk about the brain. Well, the best model of the brain I've come across is Kevin Creedon, who does a lot of work with children, a offending colleague in the States, does a lot of work with children, and this was his, you've probably seen, have you seen his model of the brain before? This is his model of the brain. Doesn't look much like a brain at the moment, but if you think this is, my arm is your spinal column, what you've got at the top of your spinal column is the brain stem, okay, which is kind of my wrist. What's your brain stem do? Does it do much? I have to take it away from you if you don't think it does. There's a lot of stuff about keeping you alive, homeostasis, all that kind of stuff. In a worm, that is the sum total of their brain, is that brain stem. In us, as you go higher up, our brain, and higher up the phylogenetic scale, you get the midbrain bit, which is broadly my thumb. And in our brains, that kind of folds in like that. And the really important bit what I'm going to talk about in a minute is the amygdala, which is relying on that sort of thumbnail there. And then the cerebral cortices, you know, this bit here, okay, that kind of folds over the midbrain, okay. And the prefrontal cortex, again, I'm going to talk a bit about that in a minute, are kind of my fingertips. Now, for lots of young people, and mainly young men, who get in lots of accidents, a lot of head injuries, which bit of their head hits the floor first? Well, it's this bit, isn't it? Okay? That has real effect upon the kind of prefrontal cortices there.
Sorry, Tony, what was Kevin's surname?
Sorry?
What was the surname? Kevin?
Creedon. C-R-E-E-D-E-N. Does some fantastic work with children. And again, bit of very big influence on me, in that saying you just can't actually, even more so with young people, you can't just sit them down and talk to them for ages. They're going to get fed up. Really so there's a few bits of ground I'm going to talk about which problems in people's life, especially in childhood, have a very big effect upon them. The first bit is the prefrontal cortex. So what he talked about, this bit here, okay, to do with decision making, expectation, etc., seems to be particularly important, as signaling the expected effects of reward and punishment. This bit here. My first job as a psychologist was a psychological assistant. I worked at a place called Headway House, which was a day centre for young people that had been in had head injuries. Generally, they were young men, been involved in car and motorcycle accidents, and they're all incredibly impulsive. I remember there's a store in the UK called Marks and Spencer's, and I remember to my dying day taking one of my worst days at work, I think, one of my early days at work, taking this young man into Marks and Spencer's for some unknown reason, I can't remember that now, but they sold lots of men and women's clothing. And the women's section, they used to have a kind of women's underwear on these kind of mannequins on the, you know. And I turned my back for a minute to find he jumped on this counter and was fondling this sort of mannequin, female underwear. So I had to try and get him out of the store while all these people were shrieking about what was actually going on. And he, prior to this car accident, he was a young man, he was going to go off to college, doing stuff like that, but after he'd had the head injury, really affected his prefrontal cortex. He was really, really impulsive and acted out very, very sexually all the time. So that's very severe, obviously, trauma, very severe kind of risk factor to head injury, but it just goes to show what actually happens when people are subject to those kind of traumatic events. This is another bit of the prefrontal cortex that has a lot to do with emotional recognition as well. The amygdala, I talked a bit about, see now I can switch this off, the amygdala, and ask you, what do you think the amygdala actually does? Come across the amygdala?
Regulates emotions.
Okay.
Stores memory.
Sort of stores emotional memories. I mean, it's quite a complicated structure. There's a number of different sections to it, yeah, but it's to do with stores emotional stuff, memories. But the most basic thing that, and I tried this out, I was in America really at this conference, and I tried this out in America, and it didn't quite work. Actually, I didn't work in a minute, but what I said was actually, I said in America, I said, we were in Kansas City or something, and I said, talk about the amygdala and what it is, I said, what would happen if a bear just burst through that door, you know? Well, what would happen? Now, I know we've got a koala bear, so not really that. If a bear did kind of just come through that door, you know, a big bear, big grizzly, big animals, what shall we have?
Bunyip.
Eh?
We have bunyips.
Bunyips? What's that? Is that a kangaroo?
Crocodile.
Yeah, a saltwater crocodile, yes. What would you do? What would you do?
Film it on my phone.
Huh?
Yes,
Well, that's right, that's what the guy said in America. He just said, oh, shoot it.
So amygdala is the trees fly.
Yeah. I mean, if a crocodile, saltwater crocodile came through, you'd either try and run away or you'd kind of actually freeze. It's interesting, we were on a holiday in the Gambia. This has got nothing to do with this talk, but I think it's astonishing we actually did this. But we went to this sacred crocodile pool, my wife, myself, and our son, I can't remember, he's about 8 at the time. And these were Nile crocodiles, but they're quite well fed because they're really stimulus response creatures, aren't they? And you can actually stroke crocodile. Just amazingly stupid thing to do, but we did it. And then afterwards we were having a cup of tea and I was sitting down up here, crocodiles are down. I looked around, there was about a 12-foot crocodile just sitting there. I said, oh, it's a crocodile. Anyway, nothing to do with it at all. But the amygdala is the bit that keeps you alive. And for a lot of offenders, the amygdala, I mean, it's searching the environment for threat. Okay? So another example, if you're out in the bush, for example, and you're walking down a path and something black just comes across your path again, what are you going to do? You're going to kind of freeze, aren't you? Okay? And that's because the amygdala is working 40 times more quickly than the bit of your brain up here, which tells you, oh, that was just a stick, basically. So it's sort of searching the environment for threat. And for a lot of offenders, everything is a threat to them. They're on hyper alert all the time. And I guess an example, if someone's in a bar and they look at the person the wrong way, and they see that's a threat, and they just go over and kind of bump them. And no amount of talking therapy, you have someone in therapy for years and years and years, no amount of therapy say, well, the next time someone looks at you wrongly in the bar, you're just going to walk away. What are they going to do next time? You do exactly the same kind of thing. So what you need is therapy to kind of dampen down that kind of threat systems. And then if you've got that, perhaps then you can start talking to people. So that's the amygdala. I think I'm taking up too much time here. Anterior cingulate cortex is another bit right to do with empathy. One of my favourite bits of the brain, the insular cortex, this is the bit which probably makes us feel human. It's the site of a lot of emotions, both negative and positive, and to do with empathetic responding. There's actually 11 bits of the brain to do with empathy, but this is one of them. So that's a very quick skip through different bits of the brain, the amygdala, prefrontal cortex, and I'll come back to that stuff in a minute. Human brain development, I'm going to talk very briefly about that, starting off from the embryo right away to 2 years of age. And what actually happens is that a lot of things happen in terms of neuronal development, the way the neurons connect together. I can never say this word, so I won't say. But the myelin sheath that makes the nerves respond more quickly, all is development over the first 2 years of your life. And what you actually have too many connections. There's something called synaptic pruning, okay? The way that those neurons are stripped away. And the things that you do a lot of, the connections get stronger, and the things that you don't do too much of get weaker, basically. So the brain is very, very complicated, as you know, for some like 86 billion neurons, not that I've actually measured them, counted them, but I'll take it anyway. And prenatal conditions such as temperature, pressure, etc., all have an effect upon the brain. And you can get risk factors here, which I'll talk about in a bit, which can really affect adversely brain development. By the age of 4, the brain is probably 80% of the adult size. Are people going to get access to these slides?
I think they can, if you're okay with it.
Okay. Or you can email me. And I can send you more stuff because I've written quite extensively about this. But yeah, you get, again, synaptic pruning, again, and that's to do with the interactions between the parent and the child. There's something called servant return circuitry, where talking to a child is going to increase those connections. Okay? Not talking to that child, being on your mobile phone all the time. I don't know if I travel on the train a lot, and I'm just aghast that people would sooner be on their mobile phones and talk to their children. And the children clearly want to interact. And the way round it is, we'll give a child a mobile phone, you know, I said, you've got to talk to your children. I don't know what's going to happen in 10 or 15 years' time, but people are not talking to their children. Would you agree?
Yeah.
Get rid of mobile phones and stuff. I was involved in some stuff in the UK, and I was asked a question. They said, what should we do about the internet? Oh, I'm very flippantly, I said, just get rid of it. Because when it first came about, I thought there's going to be a job for us at some point, but I had no idea it was going to be the level of stuff that actually happens on the internet. Anyway, the brain continues to develop, you know, throughout childhood, adolescence, even into adulthood. And the final bit to really maturate is this frontal cortex bit. And how old do you think people are before that fully maturates?
25.
25. 25. If you look at something like insurance, car driving and stuff like that, 25 people are less impulsive, think before they act, basically. Okay, 25. Okay, so that's the first bit, just that very skip through some bits of brain. If you want any more information about it, I've written quite extensively, and I've given you some stuff. Mark has stuff which we can circulate. So the second bit really is some risk factors for offending. I can't go through all of this stuff, but written about in some of the chapters about risk factors all the way from genetic risk factors to sort of developmental risk factors, postnatal risk factors like nutrition, all the way through to adverse childhood experiences. A little while ago I was asked to give a talk on something like this on the radio, a local radio station. They said, oh, we've heard that you are doing a lot of stuff about risk factors of offending. Do you want to come in and talk about that? And I said, yeah, fine. They said, well, tell us what these are. So I went through different things, and they said, you give a 10-minute talk, and then you can listen to the phone in. And afterwards I thought, why did I ever think this was a good idea? Because I went through all this stuff, and it got into nutrition. And they said, oh, yeah, I'll talk about nutrition for 10 minutes, which I did. And then afterwards I listened to the phone in, and people phoning going, no, Professor Beech, I don't know what you're talking about. I've never had breakfast and I'm not an offender. But the thing is, if you don't eat properly, there's a terrible thing that happened in this, well, lots of terrible things obviously happened in the Second World War, but in the west of Holland, in about 1944, 1945, West Holland was systematically starved population by the invading German, or by the German army. Okay? And what they did, they followed up a load of the kids that were in kind of utero. Some years later, they found a real big over-representation of antisocial personality disorder, also psychopathy. The thing is, if you don't eat properly, you don't get enough trace elements, you don't get enough zinc, you don't get enough iron, you don't get enough general protein. What's that do? It blows holes in your amygdala. So you get a kind of more fearless child, basically. My argument, again, if people don't eat properly, you know, that's not having a very positive effect on their brains, basically. Before the last election in the UK, they got a bunch of people together, including myself, to talk about sex offenders. Could they spot the really prolific sex offender, like Jimmy Savile? You come across Jimmy Savile? Yeah. Okay. And I said, you want to put all these resources in for something that is really, really hard to actually spot. You're not going to get much bang for your buck. I said there's a lot more in terms of low-hanging fruit. It's basically to do some basic primary healthcare stuff, get people to eat properly, to get people to, I'm not being mother-blaming here, but to discourage women from smoking and drinking in pregnancy, because they can have real effects upon the fetus's brain, basically. And I said, oh, we're not interested in that. We just want something that we can show in 5 years' time. We're not interested in 15 to 20-year programs. And I thought, well, just really sad, because we know what we can do to really reduce offending in a very basic kind of primary health approach, and I'm sure it's a lot better in Australia, but in the UK it's not as good as it could be, basically. Yeah?
In utero, is there any evidence of the child's environment outside, so the mother being physically or emotionally abused, or lots of yelling, or is there any evidence that there's an influence of that on fetal development?
Well, yeah, I'm going to talk about trauma in a bit, mainly, trauma in young children. But yeah, obviously it's going to have an effect, isn't it? Corticosteroids have a very real big effect on that stuff I talked about in terms of brain development, synaptic stuff, all that. So yes, in the chapters which I'll send you if you want, I'll talk about that in a lot more detail, and there's a lot of references in there. Is that okay for now?
Yes.
Okay. Anyway, so Jenna, I'm going to talk through some of these, not too many of these risk factors, but I'll start off with genetic risk factors. But what is the biggest genetic risk factor?
Being male.
Indeed, being male. Here's a photo from football from last year's Euros, and blokes, isn't it? Okay, I've got that slide off the internet. I've got this picture off the internet. I've got this other slide which I just can't understand what's going on. There's all this sort of chaos going on, and there's this bloke just sitting there. What's he doing? Is he kind of thinking, I'll just ignore this? And then someone said, in the talk again, they said, is that you? And it's just like really odd. So the biggest risk factor is being male. So we look at crime, men outnumber women in all major crime categories, whether it's burglary, robbery, criminal damage, violence against the person, etc. Why is that, do you think?
Probably a range of factors, men develop later.
Okay.
In terms
That's
of
again pretty frontal, yeah.
And probably just the way that we teach men to be men.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, there's a sociological explanation. I think there's also kind of a biological explanation as well. Because if you look, it's a very good book which I've put a reference to, but it kind of compares women to men. Because you could say about women they've got 2 X chromosomes. What you say about men, they've got 2 X chromosomes, but one of the X chromosomes is degraded into this kind of Y chromosome, basically. But if we look at women compared to men, they're more trustworthy, more reliable, more fair, have lower levels of bigotry, etc. Because there's always the argument is why do women commit fewer crimes? But the other thing is why do men commit so many crimes? Really? For women in the audience, you're going to live longer. You're low mortality at all ages. You're not so risk-taking. You're more resistant to most categories of disease, and less likely to suffer from brain disorders. Okay. This is my favourite quote from a feminist physiologist in the UK, US. It's based on hormonal stuff. Men are designed for short, brutal lives, and women are designed for long lives. I have a sort of case history of my father, actually. He's getting married again. He's 94, he's getting married again today. He's also getting married to a woman who's younger than me. I can't quite compute this. But there's not many men around anymore at his age. It's quite remarkable, really. So he's quite bankable because there's... but she is considerably younger than him. It's a weird, I can't understand it. Of course, the other thing about crime is the testosterone story. Without crime and without testosterone, none of us would exist because it's to do with sex and stuff like that. It's also to do with violence as well, promotion of violence. And if testosterone appears to reduce empathy. if you give testosterone to people and you do some fMRI stuff, the levels of testosterone goes down. If you give women testosterone, it reduces their empathy levels. And you know the best way to reduce or increase testosterone in women is for them to go out on a Friday night and consume large amounts of alcohol, certainly in the UK. Is that the thing that's happening in Australia? There's more women on women violence on Friday and Saturday night. So there's a sort of difference between men and women, basically. So that's one. I mean, so there's a lot of risk factors I could talk about. I'm just going to talk very briefly about a few other things like traumatic brain injury. Already talked about how it can really affect the kind of prefrontal cortex. Here's a study in the UK looking at traumatic brain injury in young offenders, and you can see nearly 50% reported a loss of consciousness. Frequency reported traumatic brain injury associated with more convictions. Okay. And people with traumatic brain injury are greater risk of mental health problems and misuse of cannabis. I've skipped a load of stuff. I've gone all the way from genetic right away to the kind of traumatic brain injury. I've missed out all the stuff about smoking and drinking and nutrition. But so that's all in these papers and chapters if you want to read that. And then there's adverse childhood experiences. Of course, 10 adverse childhood experiences, like recurrent physical, sexual abuse, etc., household members, physical and emotional neglect. And what you find, generally, if people have got 6 or more of those, they're likely to live 20 years less than people who haven't. If they've got 4 or more, they're more likely to suffer from a lot of physical illnesses. They're more likely to have, if we think about sex, more likely to have 50 or more sexual partners, more likely to have a teenage pregnancy. So these are big risk factors for general health. Also, I think they're big risk factors, obviously, for the commission of crime. I looked at this sample from the Ministry of Justice in 2012, really picking up a load of those adverse childhood experiences in that kind of sample. Third of all prisoners had experienced some form of abuse. Nearly half would experience observed violence in the home. Lots of alcohol problems. A third reported family members having been convicted of a serious crime. Is that any different? And this is Mark said to me, the other day, I thought I'd better look this up very quickly because I couldn't remember. How does that compare to a normative sample, a sample of nearly 8,000 people on the adverse childhood experiences? On the left there was a sample of offenders. You could see, having 4 or more ACEs, you've got nearly half of an offender sample, but only about 12% of a kind of normative sample. So another big risk factor, or set of risk factors for offending. So what does that, going back to the question that you said asked earlier on, what's that got to do with the brain? You can see trauma and abuse affects all that stuff I talked about. So affecting gene expression, affecting the way the myelin sheath goes on the nerve, affecting the way that nerves, are created, affecting the way that they're actually connected together. So very big effects. That's the kind of corticosteroid effects of that part of the brain. Also stress has a very big effect. Thirsty work up here, but also has very big effects on bits of the brain. People know what the hippocampus does? Yeah, it's sort of memories. Memory. It's called a hippocampus because it looks like a bit like a seahorse. Prefrontal cortex. Talked about that. Okay. Oh, thanks, Mark. Early stress has a very big effect upon the prefrontal cortex. Also has an effect upon the visual cortex, even the way we see, and the auditory cortex, the way we actually hear. So going back to my argument, so what we're going to do with these people who've got all these problems, you know. We're going to sit and talk to them. And show them flip charts and all, and get the right stuff down. You get to remember stuff. Okay. Also has an effect upon the corpus callosum. Anybody know what the corpus callosum does? Connects the two hemispheres, a band of about 200 million fibres. There's actually 3 bits, but the main bit is in the middle, connects the two cerebral hemispheres. More to do with the kind of connectivity of the brain. This is a scan of, I forgot I got this actually. This is a scan of, that's a corpus callosum there in a sort of a child, your average sort of child basically, if there's such a thing as average. Corpus callosum looks fairly intact. This is the corpus callosum here of a child that has been subject to significant physical and sexual abuse. The difference. So all those kind of risk factors having a very, very real effect upon people's brains. Okay? So what can we do in terms of putting the brain back into a kind of more normal level of function? So that's what we're going to talk about in the third part of this talk. Now, I said I wasn't going to talk much about sex offenders, but this is just some work from some James Cantor on sex offenders. Typically they have 10-point lower IQs, poor visual, spatial, verbal memory cues, okay? Memory scores rather. Higher rates of left-handedness. Now, left-handedness itself is not an indicator of abuse, and lots of mathematicians, artists are left-handed, but if you have been subject to early trauma, sometimes some of the functions of one hemisphere can actually move over to the other hemisphere. Higher rates of reporting childhood head injuries, more likely to be placed in special educational facilities. So you've got all that. We can do lots of cognitive behavioural therapy. I honestly think you can only get so far, so that's when we get on to the third bit of the talk, is can we do other stuff. So I'm not saying you shouldn't talk to people, I'm not saying that you shouldn't do therapy, but sometimes, I don't know if it's necessarily the first place you should actually start. Friend and colleague of mine, Paul Gilbert, who does a lot of work with compassionate focused therapy, done a lot of work with people with borderline personality disorders. Start talking to them, all their threat systems come up, all the amygdala goes into hyperactivity. They're not listening to you anymore. The minute you start talking to them, they're not listening. How can you dampen down those threat systems? How can you get to a point where you can actually talk to people? So that's what I'm going to talk about now. I suppose I should use this since I've got it on there. It doesn't work. Okay, so this is the third bit about a more holistic approach to treatment. So, because some effects of trauma particularly are not, you can't access it by verbal therapy. And there's some great people outside of the offender literature who are really worth reading. One guy's called Bessel van der Kolk, a lot of work on trauma, basically. And then Bruce Perry's done a lot of work with children, talking about kind of therapies that are effective. Bessel van der Kolk said we need therapies that depend on action rather than verbalisation. So what we'll do, a bit of action stuff now. We've been going for about 40 minutes and you're probably a bit fed up. So everybody stand up. With a real action therapy now. Okay, we're just going to sort of run around a bit on the spots. Okay? Go around. Okay. Oh, no. I bet you thought this was going to happen, didn't you? That's all okay. Right. I won't go outside, I'll come back. Okay. We haven't got too much time, but okay. We can sit down now. And do you feel any better?
Yeah.
Okay. That's what we need to do. You know, after so long in therapy, you need to do a bit more. That's what Kevin Cregan talks about. You know? After 10 minutes with a young person, you do something like a bit of Tai Chi or something like that. You know, just move things around. And again, therapy for the body rather than just for the mind, basically. Bruce Perry got something called a neurosequential model of therapeutics, in which he talks about breath now, which talks about therapy for different bits of the brain, all the way through from the brainstem to the cerebral cortex. So Stuff on the brain stem to do with massage, rhythm, drumming. Drumming's really good. Drumming in groups. It gets people to interact with each other and gets them to attune with other people. For a lot of offenders, they're not very good at attuning with other people. If you're drumming together, you've got to attune. EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing. For midbrains, things like therapeutic massage. I mean, what's the one thing actually you can't do with an offender, certainly in the UK? You can't touch them. Is it allowed? You allowed to touch people? But they can touch animals, can't they? You could stroke a dog. We've also done some stuff with equine therapy, because horses are very good at picking up on non-verbal cues and stuff like that. Okay, so you can get, in terms of that kind of attunement kind of stuff, you can do stuff with animals. Limbic system, mindfulness and breathing techniques, then get into your kind of traditional insight-orientated therapies like CBT. So I'm going to talk about a couple of those, and just talk, well, three actually. Mindfulness. What's mindfulness? That? Okay. Does anyone do mindfulness? Okay. With your clients? Or yourself? Find it useful? I mean, some of the things about mindfulness is, with offenders certainly, is the realisation that just because you have a thought, it doesn't mean that you actually have to act out on it. Oh, there's a plug for this neuros. Well, this is probably not going to be the colour, but this might be the colour. But in this book, there's things around all sorts of treatments for offenders, for therapy for acquired brain injury, using EMDR, using compassion-focused therapy, using sort of self-regulation stuff. So if you're interested in some of those chapters, I can send you those, just as long as you don't give them to all and sundry, otherwise no one's going to buy the book. No one's going to buy the book at 250 quid anyway. It's this has been a labour of love, that book, it really has. It got bigger and bigger and bigger, and the publishers, when I finally gave it to the publishers, they came back to me and said, you were contracted to do 250 to 280,000 words, and it's 420,000 words. What are you going to do about it? God, I mean, I've got some other editors as well, so I couldn't bear sort of editing it down. They said, oh, we could turn it into 2 volumes, so it's going to be 2 volumes, so that's probably why it's so expensive. Anyway, there's quite a list of neuroscientific interventions in there. I'm just going to talk about mindfulness, a bit about biofeedback, and a very little bit about animal-assisted psychotherapy. So mindfulness is about, as was said, paying attention in a particular way, and it can be inculcated through a variety of meditation and exercises. It's not a relaxation technique, okay, but it's to be in the moment, actually. Okay? And if people are more in the moment, again, the idea is you maybe dampen down some of those kind of threat systems. Certainly there's some evidence, some neuroscientific evidence, that time spent in mindfulness really increases the thickness of the prefrontal cortex. It can actually affect the brain and can actually affect the insular bit, one of the areas to do with empathy, to do with mindfulness techniques. So they're trying to bring in some mindfulness techniques, certainly with in prison in the UK. Here's a bit of brain scanning, finding that amygdala activation is negatively correlated with mindfulness during an affect labeling, affect labeling task. Okay? So through mindfulness, you're kind of dampening down the kind of threat systems in the amygdala. So useful kind of things maybe to do just before you start talking therapy with. It's gone off. It's gone off. Oh, it's there, but it's not on here.
Oh, well, just carry along.
I'll try to turn that on the way.
There you go.
Oh, okay. That's worrying. Okay, so, mindfulness, dampening down that kind of threat systems that are going on in a lot of offenders' heads. As for evidence of mindfulness, effective mindfulness with offenders, there's some studies there. The most amazing study I found is by somebody called Singh, who did some mindfulness with probably a very, very difficult group of sex offenders who had intellectual disabilities, who were personality disordered, and I'll say also sex offenders. And the particular techniques was looking at mindfulness on the soles of your feet. And what the clients reported was they still had these very deviant kind of thoughts, but they'd see them as clouds that drifted through their mind and then just drift through the other side, basically, without them actually having to act on it. So the idea that a thought is not an act. You know? They still have deviant thoughts, but they won't become deviantly aroused to those thoughts. We've done stuff on controlled breathing techniques. And we've got a little program called Journey into the Wild Divine, which you can buy. I have no shares in this, but we could pretty good. And it's all about breathing. It's the simplest thing to do. Go into breathing, isn't it? The best way to get into a kind of mindful state, and every time I try it with people, it never ever works, and I think probably because I don't quite do it for long enough, is to breathe at 6 breaths a minute. So can we try a few of those? So if we breathe in, everyone's have to be in it, breathe in. So hold it a bit, and breathe out. I always feel better after this because I'm slightly more anxious, wound up here than you are probably. Okay, now don't breathe in. Hold it. Breathe out. So we do one more. Breathe in. Hold it. And breathe in. Anyone notice any difference? No.
We were already relaxed, that's probably.
Everybody probably already relaxed, yeah. Okay. But 6 breaths a minute. Because many forms of meditation focus on the breath and slow breathing techniques. Because when you breathe in, your heart rate goes up. When you breathe out, it slows down through the effect of the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve to do with the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay. So by breathing 6 breaths a minute, you can put people in a more kind of relaxed state, and more focused on, in terms of therapy, basically. Of course, if you've got increased vagal nerve output, you increase your heart rate variability. What's really good is to have at least 20 BPM difference. Well, people your age and we're 10 BPM is good enough for me because I'm getting on a bit. In fact, I'm still breathing is probably quite good. Anyway, 20 BPM between when you breathe in, heart rate goes up, to when you breathe out, and it kind of slows down. And if there you can get a cycle of that breathing in and breathing out, you get something called coherence. Okay? But that kind of breathing may account for a state of relaxation in mindfulness meditation, which has an effect upon the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, increasing blood flow here, activity in the prefrontal cortex, reducing activity in the amygdala, basically. And that heart rate variability has been shown in a number of studies to increase cognitive and emotional flexibility and other stuff. Okay? Simple techniques, very, very simple techniques. There's also some evidence of heart rate variability with activity in the dorsal prefrontal cortex during emotional induction. Through some breathing techniques. This is what we use, or have used. Journey to the Wild Divine. In the UK, it's about £140 or something like that, and there's 3 sensors. And there's a sensor for, I think now it is the ear, but originally it was a sense of heart rate in the middle finger, and a couple of sensors for skin conductors for anxiety levels. there's a loads of little games which are great fun to do with people, and it's a really good way to kind of lock people into doing therapy, because therapy is fun. So there's some games like stacking stones with your mind. Okay? But at the very basic level, it's breathing to this butterfly here at 6 breaths a minute. And there's a readout on kind of heart rate, and then a readout on coherence then. So the more your in and out heart rate coheres, the more likely it is to become blue. So that's the kind of stuff we're using for it. It's quite effective actually with the offenders. And the last bit is, one day I'm going to get a laugh out of this. I'll never get a laugh out of this stuff. I love it, but animal-assisted psychotherapy is probably not this. You know, for dogs that are here managing anything, my dog is always open. Benefits of animal-assisted psychotherapy: they provide social support and form of love. I don't care what offenders do. The dog doesn't care. Someone once said to me, if you were to lock, and most people got dogs, dogs. If you were to lock your dog in a car for a few hours, I know it'll probably die, but in England it's not so warm, or your loved one in a car for a few hours and you came back, who'd be the most pleased to see you? Because they just emit, don't they? Just emit this sort of jolly stuff, don't they? But they provide support in the form of love and acceptance. They're not dependent. They don't care what people actually like, what they've actually done. Bonds with animals are relaxed and intimate contrast to many of those with humans. And need for animals to be careful fulfills the human need to be needed, nurtured, and to be loved. I haven't got time to go into it, but we've been looking at some levels of oxytocin in offenders. And that's a sort of self-soothing neurochemical, which again, if you massage or if you stroke a dog, it increases the kind of levels of oxytocin. People press me, we've done some work by looking at oxytocin levels in psychopaths. I can tell you about that afterwards, but I haven't really got time now. And look, this is some therapy on death row. And look, you know, this guy's obviously clearly done dreadful things, but little dog sitting on the lap there, there's a bloke here sort of stroking that dog. Just shows that, you know, some compassion going on sort of between that man and dog. So that's me, really. I don't think I'm going to have much time for questions, but anyway, I mean, I suppose the aim of the talk was really to suggest that CBT is very much of a sort of top-down approach, and what we might need to think about in therapy is more kind of bottom-up stuff, therapies of the body. So people can, you know, if they get very hecked up, if they're in a bar and someone looks at them the wrong way, they can dampen that down without going and thumping someone. For sex offenders, if they're sort of getting aroused, that they can use some strategies that are kind of will calm them down so they don't necessarily go on to offend. I guess the final point is from colleague Paul Gilbert, and we were talking a while ago, and he said it's not quite handy. He said what he thought therapy in the years to come won't be based on something like DBT or CBT, but therapies on particular bits of the brain. And I guess in the Handbook of Forensic Neuroscience, that's what we've been trying to argue, really. So that's me done. And any questions? Oh, okay.